Thank you, Viviette. We're going to do short introductions, so I will start. I'm Katya Crawford, and I'm a professor and the chair of the Landscape Architecture Department at UNM, and I am a tree lover, big time. It's really hard to not be a tree lover if you're into landscape architecture, or maybe if you're human. We'll figure it out. I also just want to say that I'm not Krista Tippett, but I'm going to do my best to moderate this panel of amazing people. So let's start with you. And yes, so there's a mic that can be passed around. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
And I'm willing to share this too, to my left or to my right.
And can you hear me? Okay. I'm Daniel Ballesteros. I'm a photographer from the Bay Area, and been photographing trees for about 20 years.
Hi, I'm JP. I live here in Albuquerque. My pronouns are she, her, he, him, they, them. I spell she, her with parentheses around the H and the E in both those words. And I'm a tree climber and tree steward. And I have 2 public projects I'm working on that involve trees in one way or another.
Hey everybody, thanks for coming. My name's Welly Fletcher. I'm an artist here in Albuquerque, and I teach sculpture at UNM. And that's my sculpture over there. I work in a lot of materials. One of them is wood, and I love a lot of things about trees and wood, and something in particular is just the resonance, hardness, softness, color, texture. And I also have a hard time loving trees because I love to work with the bodies of trees, and I think about their lives and the time of our lives. And so happy to talk with all of you more about that tonight. Great.
And my name is Sean O'Neill. I'm the city forester for the city of Albuquerque. So hypothetically, I oversee all green things within the city. So we're housing Parks and Rec, so I get to try and oversee all the trees in the park system, work with other departments overseeing trees in the medians, our bosque and open space, and other nonprofit work, trying to keep the city green, add more vegetation within it. So yeah, it's a fun aspects of trees in an urban zone. It's a very niche thing, trying to get trees to grow in the city. So it's been a real honor to serve the position.
I'm Oliver Polzin. I'm a painter, primarily now, but I was an installation artist, immersive installation artist for about 12, 15 years before this. One of the original members of Meow Wolf. I just am obsessed with the human relationship to non-human species.
Hi everyone, I'm Shelby Stinson, big time tree lover. And I'm also the program manager at a nonprofit called Signal for the Climate Resilient Cities program, and the chair of the co-chair, of the Air and LED Coalition, which is a local interdisciplinary network of practitioners and advocates of green stormwater infrastructure, which essentially, when it works well, uses stormwater to water plants and trees. It comes with a whole host of other benefits, but really good for trees.
Okay, and the empty seat there is for Anthony Fettis. I'm going to introduce him. He's running a bit late. He taught studio today, a design studio until 5 o'clock, the Indigenous Design Studio. And he is an ecologist. He's worked all over the world for 15 years doing ecological sort of assessment. And he is an assistant professor at the University of New Mexico, and I feel really lucky to work with him. So I'm gonna embarrass him when he comes in and lead him to the front, or just wave madly. Thank you all. I'm so excited to be here with you. A little bit nervous as well, because I feel like, how do we do this in an hour? Like, we could just hang out for a month and geek out. But I'm gonna start with you, JP. And I came in a week ago or so and watched a video of you doing kind of like a pilgrimage to this particular tree that I felt like I knew. Like, I imagined it being in the South Valley along in Acequia, but it was probably somewhere else. What I would like to know about your sort of process is what you learned from the tree in your pilgrimages to this particular tree and climbing it, and anything else that you would like to share about your process and your relationship to this living being.
Yeah, I live in the North Valley actually, and that tree is near my home, just down the Acequia. And that tree taught me so much. I had been climbing I climbed trees when I was very young, and then picked it up shortly before the pandemic, and then was climbing a lot during the pandemic because I was very alone. And I climbed that tree every day for 3 months before that ceremony took place. And I just happened to have someone who's a filmmaker that was visiting me and filmed it. So that's why there's documentation. But I still climb that tree. That was a year and a half ago now, and all the tetherings are still on the tree. So I continue to learn from it. It just, I think the tree taught me to tolerate a high level of discomfort and fear. Getting to a certain level of height, around 30 feet, is when the body just kicks in fear and you can't really manage it anymore. It's just a natural human response. And so I did higher climbs and stages. It feels like just a metaphor for a lot of what's happened socially in recent times. So.
Yeah. Okay. You know, your work is so physical. It's so sort of embodied, and one of the things that you speak about in your work, Welly, is this just phenomenological approach to knowledge, this way of, I'm trying to think of the term that you used. I use embodied knowledge, but it's like body and intelligence. I'll let you use the words that you use. But it's similar in a way to this process that JP describes in their work. Would you speak to and expand upon a little bit this relationship with trees and their former lives?
Yeah, and for me, the body-based intelligence is like my primary interest in working with materials and sculpture. So not just wood, but metal, steel, aluminum, brass, stone, felt, and I came to sculpture with kind of desiring to find a way to kind of bypass how obsessed we are with our thinking minds and kind of rational thought. And so a good answer is listening and receiving, and that's led me to learn a lot about kind of communication with non-human material, and that's living and also non-living. Like so, collecting stones was one of the first things I did. I thought, this is the most inanimate, this is the most unalive thing, this is the most non-conscious. And then the more time I spent with them, I'm like, oh my God, you know, infinite worlds in stones. So wood specifically for me brings up almost like a similar time frame as a human body. I think, you know, hundreds of years as opposed to thousands of years or a year or a second. And the resonance of wood, you know, instruments are made of different woods to have different kind of resonance, and that kind of hums or harmonizes or speaks to like the material of our physical bodies in ways that I think are not about kind of conscious thinking. It's feeling, but it's also, I like the word that's come up in animal studies over the last number of years of attunement. Yeah, attunement, because you're not anthropomorphizing, I'm just kind of getting in tune with the material. And in that way, I feel like there's a listening involved, but it's not just this kind of listening, it's kind of a whole body listening. And I feel strongly that our minds have kind of led us to some precarious places now, and that maybe attuning to other beings and other objects and sculpture that is unspeaking can lead us to kind of a different intelligence that I think we already have. I just think we spend a whole lot of time in a certain circuitry up here. So I'm really interested in sculpture also as a way to kind of impact and have a different experience of presence. And a living tree, I mean, as a whole, I think we all know the feeling of being with that being. And I think sculpture can do something that's different. It's kind of in our world and communicating almost on levels of poetics and actual visual communication. So maybe that addressed some parts of your question.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, when I think of working with wood that is also the body of a tree, there's something in working with iron or aluminum or some other process where there's all this invisible stuff that happens before the material arrives to us. Whereas it's very hard to mistake wood. I mean, one can, but to have that sort of feeling. And, you know, I think it could be an interesting transition to circle over to Daniel's work, but I wanna also open it up to the panel to see if anyone has any thoughts or responses to what you've heard so far.
No, it's interesting to hear on more of the technical side of like resource management or environmental engineering, the ability of seeing trees in a different way and trying to connect community to do that. So a lot of people will drive around and there's trees in cities, but very seldom do you actually see that tree in a city. When you go to a forest, then you start seeing trees because you're looking for them. But seeing a tree that lives a harder life, like trees down Central definitely live a harder life than a tree in a forest. But having that connection piece of understanding that it's a living thing that's providing benefits, like both market and non-market benefits of what shade it provides and all the other things it'll take up carbon-wise and scientifically, but just being in an area with trees and how that makes you feel and connect, being in a more urban zone. So definitely connecting to those pieces of like you referenced like a stone, you don't realize at first you thought it was more of an inanimate object. You see all the history of how that stone became a thing. And there's a lot of life to it, and then same for an urban tree that is struggling along to grow, but it has a huge amount of benefits to like where it is in its community. And the little space that was designed for it may not have always been the best space, but it's the space it gets to occupy at that moment, which is unique.
And I think that's a perfect segue.
Yeah, I've been photographing those trees along Central for the last like 48 hours, pretty obsessively because they're just gorgeous. But one of the things Welly said that I connect with, or that resonates with me in my work is the idea that the visual language that we're working in is saying something that we can't communicate with words. And that's ultimately why I take pictures, is because I can't say those things in words. And to ask me to describe them would just sort of kill the pictures. And so I definitely connect with that and the use of art and the visual mediums to sort of connect and to get a little bit deeper with, well, in this case, the trees.
Right, and one of the things that you speak about in your work is trees as bearing witness. And I think, Sean, you know, well, we know that trees bear witness to all sorts of things, and if we are literate in that particular language, we can read those systems. But for you in particular, it's the trees are witness to a homicide, a gun.
Yeah, so the way that I operate when I go to a place or even where I live, I use crime maps to determine where I am to go to find. I basically think of a crime map as it's like a 21st century map. This is what mapping is, and I think of myself as a landscape photographer. And in a different time, a landscape photographer would just take the newest map and go out and explore and photograph, and then they would get back using that map. And then when I started thinking about what a landscape photographer does in the 21st century and the function they have, I started thinking about maps and what are new maps? And this is how I came to, well, backing up a little bit, where I come from, St. Louis, Missouri, is when I was growing up, every single day that's all I heard about every day was how many homicides there were, where they were, and that was the evening news every single day. And so that like buried itself deep in me, and I didn't even know it until about 5 years ago when I started doing this project. I started working on it, and I started realizing that what I was seeing and what I was connecting with were these, basically like these stories, these news stories. And I'm very specific about not finding out too many details about what took place where I am, because that's not what my pictures are about. But it's how I ground myself while still being a landscape photographer, because I think it's really easy, because of the legacy of all of the really great photographers, but all the old white guys like Ansel Adams and those guys that photograph gorgeous mountains and beautiful places. And I think about where I fit into that. And even though I've moved out to California and I'm so close to all these beautiful places, and I used to live here in New Mexico and all these gorgeous places, I cannot get away from the trees on Central, or the trees on Broadway, or the trees on whatever main street I'm near. And Yosemite just isn't as beautiful as those things to me. So that's where.
So I'm hoping that through your description of this, that folks in here will start to witness trees in the urban environment and to see trees in a new way, and also through your comments as well, Sean. I'd like to ask Shelby to talk about a project that she has done with grade school kids that is called Hug a Tree, that is really about this it's a very simple exercise in many ways, but it is really, I think, connects what Welly is talking about, what JP has described, the idea of seeing an urban tree or a tree that you begin to take into your care. So, and we have those sheets available for you if you care to. If you walk away today with a tree, or if you, the card's up there. If you walk away today with a tree, or you decide that you're gonna fall in love with a tree that you've never met before, I'll hand it over.
Yes, so I also have a background in environmental education. And there can sometimes be a lot of pressure to do a lot of curriculum building or a lot of teaching, but I think especially when I would take kids outside, field trips, all I really wanted them to do was to sit quietly and be present, pay attention, and connect. So I came up with this little exercise that I love, and I think essentially it's a slip of paper. Every student gets a pencil and something to write on, and the instruction is to go find a tree, your own tree, and simply spend a couple of minutes observing the tree with all of your senses. And then choose one of a few activities, or of a few, like draw the tree. You can sketch the tree. You can write a story about your tree. You can write a letter to your tree. I think a comic strip was on there. And then actually I just added, write down 10 questions that you have about your tree, because I realized that there wasn't really anything on there for the analytically minded kid. Some people connect through inquiry, and so coming up with 10 questions about your tree, that was an option too. And so it's very, very simple. I've done this with middle school and high school kids, but I think it's for everybody, and it's just my favorite thing to watch a bunch of kids who at first are wondering if it's cool or not, and then very quickly they go find their tree, and they all love it. So I've seen a lot of kids will name their tree, and talk to them or come up with stories, tell us what they think their tree's life is like. Lots of different things can come out of that. But I think it's funny that it's the simplest activity I've ever created, and I think the most powerful, because all of these like stewardship values that we hope people grow up to have, you know, that's all founded on this personal connection to nature. And I don't think we can really teach that, but we can create a space where it can be discovered. And yeah, I think I saw that a little bit happen. So I hope you all take a slip and go hug a tree.
And listen to a tree. I was doing a lecture on plants for a site and environment course, and it's a combination of architecture and landscape architecture students. This was a few years ago. And I took everybody outside, there were maybe 60 people in the class or something, and I had them all smelling trees. And one of my students said, "Katya, I've never seen anyone get an architect to smell a tree." I was so proud of myself. I was like, right on. Yeah. So, Tony, and actually Shelby and John, you can answer this sort of next question. You brought it up a bit, Shelby, in your introduction, is what you do with green stormwater infrastructure, which is something that, you know, goes by GSI. It sounds like some gastrointestinal issue.
I prefer rainwater harvesting. I think
Yes.
it's nicer.
Yes, right. And so I just want to give a little bit of context to the question about what that is. In that, you know, there's a movement that is connected with this exhibition called, I'm forgetting the name, Let's Plant ABQ. And we had this amazing woman, Rosetta Elkin, come to UNM and give a lecture on her book that was about, I think it was called A Plant Life, the Politics of Afforestation. A title similar to that, thank God for Google. Anyway, her kind of plea was like, we can't just plant trees. We have to grow trees, and we have to grow with them. And we have to have this relationship that is mutual, that is knowledgeable, that is empathetic, sympathetic, that is humble, that is like all of these things if we want this life to grow in this world that we have increasingly made harder for pretty much all life forms. And so in the high desert, we're saying plant ABQ with a lot of trees that are not, weren't here before. I mean, Albuquerque, I don't know if it was ever, aside from the watershed areas, populated with lots of trees. So this is where green stormwater infrastructure or rainwater harvesting comes in, and also a very special list of trees. So you two can, which Shelby you were a part of, and you can both talk. Tony, you go first, and then Shelby can talk about the amazing tree list.
So what was the question?
Green stormwater infrastructure, like why the relevancy of it in the high desert.
Sure.
The importance of it.
I mean, one of the biggest challenges, of course, of any urban area is how much impervious surfaces we create. We're fundamentally changing the entire ecosystem by paving it over. But when we do create these paved surfaces and rooftops, we have the opportunity to actually harvest the water that comes from these surfaces. And what we often don't recognize, of course, we think of pollution being, oh, it's the emissions from the vehicles, the compounds that are coming off your tires, and the garbage that might be floating around that gets into our aquatic systems. But there's other things that we don't really think about. You know, one of the biggest challenges for these systems is even thermal pollution, which is, it's hot out when it rains. That rainwater, especially if you're in a place like Santa Fe, or you get further up into areas where there might be cold water fisheries, that can also be a challenge. And that these rainwater harvesting systems are a very important way that we can get that runoff to be filtered by biological systems. And we're just only beginning to find out what these, not just the plants, but the microorganisms, the fungi, what they can do to help remediate some of the challenges that are created in our urban environments. But but also, you know, kind of on a more personal note, yes, I was smelling trees this morning. I went hiking, and I can't help myself every time I'm around Ponderosa Pines. So I do that on a regular basis, I admit. But one of the things that I'm always completely blown away by is just what we can learn from just observing plants and, of course, spending time with them and trees. And I feel like it's so personal when I plant something in my yard and I can see it struggling and I just want to know why. And you know, even having a background in ecology and natural resources, and I know all these different tools and I know the proper planting, you know, procedures, and I still, it's so frustrating when I see, you know, that not working out. But the trees, the plants have this embodied knowledge that they're working with what they're given, and you know, that's an indicator that something's not right. So yeah, I think there's so much that we can learn from it. I don't know if that around the circle.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think what I love about GSI or rainwater harvesting is that it does so much all at once. It kind of works as this the system that like brings our city more in tune with the ecological like function of where we are. Like Tony talked about, it can filter and clean stormwater so that to improve water quality before that water reaches the river. We can grow more plants around the city if we design our built environment to drain some of that stormwater into roadside basins or capture from a downspout. Of course, then that means that you can have more habitat for pollinators and wildlife. Air quality is affected in there. And heat, of course, is huge here in the arid Southwest. Our cities are getting hotter, and having plants around cools things down. Yeah, so I think I lost my train of thought.
Climate
We
ready
need to talk
tree
about
list.
climate ready trees.
Yeah.
So I think part of designing these green stormwater infrastructure projects, or really any like urban forestry project, is because this is living infrastructure, and trees are infrastructure. I think it's cool because they're very transcendent. Like they do a lot of things that infrastructure does. They provide services, but also they evoke art and cultural and like social cohesion, and all of these things are more intangible. But so the details matter. The details matter, and it starts with choosing which tree to plant. And so I was part of a group of experts that created this list called the New Mexico Climate Ready Trees List, where we essentially were created a process to evaluate tree species and how well suited, well adapted they are to survive in urban areas here in our specific place on Earth, in our climate year-round, as it is now, and as it will be throughout the lifespan of the tree, which can be up to a century. And so these trees on this list are smart choices. They'll survive and thrive if they're given the right care to become mature trees, which really give the most benefit, and is what we're all, I think, striving for as the urban forestry community here, to get those trees to maturity. Yeah, anyone want to add? Go ahead.
Well, I don't have anything to say.
Well, I can ask you a question.
Well, I mean, I don't know, it just makes me think of that kind of like snowball effect thing. The Bill Mollison quote comes to mind. You can think of a forest as a bunch of trees, or you can think of it as a lake, which is just a goofy way to say that, like, water, the catchment that's happening there has been storing itself in these trees long term, and then that's attracting more water, and that there's like there's like a non-linear curve to that process.
I'll just add a bit about the work around climate ready trees, and I think a lot of the engineering side of trying to create a shaded city is trying to be as least wrong as you can be for whoever's doing your job 30 years from now. And that's really the goal of the Climate Trees list, is a way that we can score and metric things. So even now we're seeing a lot of elm hybrids are doing well in urban environments because they're a hybridized elm. It gives you the diversity of, it's an elm species that grows well, but it's also, they're slightly different. So it can be a little bit more resilient than a bug that comes through and picks on one species. We have more than just one. But also if we see something not performing in a certain way, or a tree that was planted even just 8 years ago having a consistent failure, we can now actually put that into the metric of like moving a number on that list of like, this tree is still a good tree, but it has higher consequences if it's planted too deep. Like we're seeing that tree, like not just in a windstorm, if a tree falls over, the root ball comes up, and that's like a lot of trees will just snap. So if they fall over and they snap like a matchstick, it's because they're rotting at the flare. And we're starting to notice these things of brand new species of trees that exist because they're engineered to exist. We can actually keep record for whoever is managing things in the future of like, this is what happened that we saw now. So we change our decisions, and hopefully that makes it better for you. At least I can see that data change. So.
I think, you know, one of the things when I was reading about our guests here today, and also thinking about the way that we use language and the way that we describe ourselves, it's very hard, I think, in English and in Western culture to situate ourselves, to see ourselves as a part of nature. We talk about the natural world a little bit like it's just sort of what right outside, or maybe we have 1 foot in the natural world and the other one has like a torch and is burning it down or something. Like it's something that is sort of very, very separate. And I would like, I don't know, Oliver, do you have a thought about that? Because the way you described yourself as a naturalist, and also this idea of creating these, being in a world, a mystical sort of world, how do you position human nature with nature and that relationship? And I'm actually interested in that perspective from everybody.
Yeah, wow, well, yeah, I think you touched on that sort of idea of, you know, one foot in nature, one hand in nature, and one with a flaming,
or an iPhone, I don't know.
iPhone, absolutely, burning those pixels. And I think that's a really common way of looking at humanity, and I think that that's too bad. I think we've got to come up with something more profound. To me, all of this comes back to fossil fuels, that there's this period in history is just completely dominated by the reemergence of this incredible power source back onto the surface of the planet. And, you know, the fact that we utilize that makes total sense from an organismic perspective. Of course, we're going to utilize whatever resources we can to go and do what we can. I mean, we're, you know, hand-based creatures. We want to make things. We want to push things forward. But the fact that that has, you know, these incredible other repercussions that we're all coming to grips with on a daily basis, you know, it's just, it's the era that we live in. And I think it's important to remember that that process is about an actual organism. These are the ancestors of the trees, the algae, that are so deep back in time, you know, sedimented, fell down underneath the soils and became this, you know, fermented liqueur of just, you know, ancient power. But these are organisms. These are real spirits, to use a double meaning. And those spirits coming back into the biosphere is this tormented process, but it's also a beautiful process. I mean, daily, right at this very moment, trees are reintegrating that carbon that we think of as, you know, so often as this just thing on a spreadsheet, but like that carbon that was those actual organisms is reintegrating into the plants. We eat the plants, you know, it's coming right back into the system, and we're integrating these ancient organisms. And I think that is at least a starting point of where to go with a new story about how humanity is interacting.
Curiosity, right?
Yeah.
So we've talked a little bit about time is also a big part of this process. I think you mentioned, Sean, in 30 years, thinking about who might be the caretaker of the urban forest in 30 years. We've also talked about sort of deep time, how things have sped up this sort of rapid change in our sort of environments. I'm wondering about an idea of optimism that is not necessarily based in being naive, that is based in love and curiosity and all of the good things that we can embody, as well as being destructive. And art is one of those ways to do that. I'm curious about the conversations. I know some of you are educators, others you're educating with your artwork or seeing the world through a different perspective. What sort of conversations you have with your students? Okay, let's open it up though. Maybe not just students, but anyone who wants to be a collaborator in this.
I feel like the conversations I'm having are with the trees, actually. So it's interesting I will admit I'm having a hard time hanging with all the conversation because it's very here, and like when I'm with the trees, it's like here. It's like very, like I have to not fall out of the tree. And that's on me, because they tell me, we're not gonna drop you. So they have been bearing witness for us since before capitalism. And so like, I feel like a lot of the conversation's getting heady, because it's like, we exist in capitalism, how do we get out of it? It's like the project. But the thing they keep saying, like all of them, so consistently, is we've been bearing witness. Don't make us complicit. Stop making us complicit. They're very distressed about this. And perhaps the urban forest is like the most vocal about this when they find their voices. But the ones, Albuquerque's interesting. The trees here are incredibly vocal, but if you go to other urban spaces, it's like sometimes the energy is like very compressed in the tree and they can't, they're just, there's like a suppression. But here they're like incredibly vocal. And this is just the thing all of them have said to me very consistently. We don't want to be complicit anymore. So.
I think, is that saying it's over?
No.
What time is it?
I just want to say,
Okay.
I missed when you were talking about the exercise you do with the kids. I sort of was excited that I thought you were going to say, and then I also added that they would ask questions to the trees, like 9 questions to the tree. So I just love that and I was like, asking questions, scientific inquiry, but it'd be, I can imagine too, like asking questions to the tree, and I wanted to ask, like, are the trees optimistic? I wonder.
I wrote it as asking questions about your tree, so I think that could be interpreted about your tree, yeah. About them. Please continue, sorry.
I think there's also something I've read in the conversation about keen observation. And during the pandemic, JP, I started walking every morning for 3 miles or so in the bosque at the crack of dawn or sometimes before dawn. And it was absolutely amazing and I still do it. So it's been going on now for, since 2020. And it's amazing to see the rhythm of a landscape change. And the bosque without the trees is almost like very difficult to imagine. But the cottonwoods also have particular needs to continue to propagate in terms of flooding and whatnot. But there's something about being there every single day and saying hello to this world that is just so incredibly beautiful and powerful, and watching those sort of subtle changes. And I will tell you, too, that like, you know, I'm hesitant at the end of the conversation to bring up the discussion about native versus exotic versus invasive. All of these things that get associated with trees, and I know that there are some trees that my students love to hate, and I always love the trees that everyone loves to hate, and it's a big fiery conversation. But I have been watching how the porcupines love the bark of the Russian olives, and I have been watching how the hawks love the Siberian elms because they're like the tallest, you know, to like survey. And I saw a family of raccoons the other morning, like climbing up one. I've never seen raccoons in the Bosque before. And so this like slow sort of unveiling of, I don't know, like I'm learning so much from this place that I have lived in for many, many years through this daily kind of ritual. And I think this idea of ritual, whatever it is you choose to do, to think about this sort of living world, it's beautiful and wondrous and curious. I have lost track of time. We're good? How about?
Another 10 minutes,
Okay.
and then we'll have a couple questions from the.
I would love anybody in the panel, first of all, like, is there something, a burning thing that you just really want to say, that you're really passionate about? You don't have to, but.
I think representing what you said, like bearing witness of a tree, is in management, sometimes you forget that. I know when we have crews doing tree work, either in a bucket and they're 65 feet off the ground, or they're in a tree roped up with chainsaws, trying to like increase the ability of wind passing through that tree, so that tree doesn't get stressed out by massive wind events. We kind of get blind to it, you're just managing the thing. But then when we unfortunately do have to take down a big tree, you realize how long it's been there and what it's seen. So even in some of our older parks, when we, like Roosevelt, those trees were actually planted, like Clive Dingley introduced Siberian elms when he was governor, like oops, but like a lot of free trees. I try not to hate trees, because like a free tree and they're expensive. But those are planted as seeds. So they're actually planted as seeds, not how we traditionally plant a tree now. And so back when they were planted, they were 6 feet off the curb. In a lot of those parks, they're now in the curb and breaking the curb, and they're huge trees. And then when it takes time to actually have to remove one because it's dying, and it takes 3 days to do that, it slows you down to realize what that tree has been around for humanity as it exists at this moment in this space. And same with the bosque, like big trees in that forest, that when we take a tree down in the urban zone, until we have a trunk and then we can't safely cut it any higher, so then we have to take it actually like a true falling of a tree. And even just the stump of those are so big and powerful that when we drop it in a park, it vibrated the ground so much it broke irrigation. Yeah, that was wild. So that is one of those like humbling moments of realizing, yeah, we had a management decision to make, but that was a 1940s, 1935 tree. And then same when we have a burn in the bosque, we've had 2 in the past few years, 1 really recently. And then you're going out, and when we survey those trees, we see how big they are. And even though they're flood-based trees, they're like 38 inches. And I like my hug space is like 25 inches.
I want to know my hug space.
Yeah, like I've been out there, like yeah, that's a good 25-inch tree. But those trees were the last kind of flood before the levees and engineering went in, like in the 40s. And so when you're in those trees, you're in a big bosque burn, and you're first thinking, man, there's a lot of loss of canopy. That's a bummer, and how are we gonna grow this space back now that the river doesn't flood here anymore? But then you kind of slow down as you're working in there, and you spend 3 days figuring out the damage, that those trees were around for 80, 100 years. And like they're not really speaking anymore. Now it's kind of like a boneyard. So it's a very unique thing of listening to trees and slowing, when you have the ability of slowing down and realizing the age of the thing you're working with is a very unique thing.
And a life, and it's still energy, even when it's not pulling up water and,
Yeah, a lot of
providing habitat.
they'll get turned into wood chips, and then they get planted around new trees. So at least they get recycled in some way to be we planted wood chips around a tree to help the soil and also to help keep the mowers away from them. But like a lot of our recycled wood chips are from management, so every time we plant a new tree, the wood chips we use came from somewhere of an urban tree or the bosque or someplace that gets another use out of it. And hopefully that tree that we plant will be, you know, in 80 years still there and thriving, so.
You touched on fire, and I just think it's important in a conversation about trees in New Mexico to be talking about the wildfires, just the incredible fuel loads that are present. And you know, we had like the 2 biggest wildfires in New Mexico history just 2 years ago, and there's no reason that there's not going to be more. You know, we had an incredible wet year this year, but I just think it's so important for everybody to like continue to learn more and more about the types of policies and practices that make those, you know, massive mega fires less probable. And this all changed. We used to have fire-adapted ecosystems here. This all changed in the late 1800s when the railroad came, and that meant that you could bring cows out and have them graze the mountains and then ship them back to St. Louis for dinner. And the cows ate the grass that was the normal carrier of fire. And by suppressing fires in that kind of accidental way like that, it meant that the forests grew much, much thicker. There's so much, like the density of trees is just so much higher than it was in those fire-adapted times. And so now what you get, instead of this low-lying grass fire that, you know, goes through this savanna, and there's, you know, giant ponderosas that don't care at all about that kind of fire. Now you have fires that build up and up the increasing size of fuels and create these crown fires and sterilize the soil. And that's just an incredibly different situation. And I think that there's, you know, some really incredible work being done, but we need more and more people in the forest removing the fuel loads in some kind of way. Turn it into mulch, I guess, because mulch kicks ass.
I also think, you know, I read this statistic once that, you know, we spend 90% of our time indoors. And most of my students, some of my former students are here and current students are here, get into landscape architecture because they love being outside. Yet even in that profession, you're inside and largely in front of a computer. And I think we need to rebel. Have field schools. We need to spend more time outside and listening to this living landscape. And let's get rid of the word maintenance and have it be something like, because it has such a negative sort of connotation.
Stewardship.
But stewardship, I kind of like, but I also feel like it implies that we know best. I think we need humility, like be some sort of co-collaborator or even a servant. I mean, it's like, you know, this idea that also being designing landscapes. So I get people that say, I want it to be beautiful and no maintenance and cheap and I'm like, what? You know, this idea that like the living world can bring so much joy and curiosity, and we have to stop thinking about landscapes in capitalist terms of money and maintenance and all of those things. Yes, there is an economy around it, but what is out there and living is like priceless. You can't even put a dollar sign on it. And that, I mean, that's I took advantage of having a microphone. All right. I apologize. Any questions or thoughts from the audience?
I have a slightly optimistic expression I was taught by an architect. In the battle of man versus nature, nature always wins.
But then it's again nature and man being separate, you know?
Then we become
Yeah.
a servant of that which becomes our superior.
I like mutual aid.
I once heard something that was like, the humans are the grass's greatest assets in the war against the trees.
Wow. I'm gonna stand up so I can see people. There's someone right behind you and then we'll get to you.
I wonder, when you plant a tree, must you provide a water source for it?
You have to provide the water source before you plant the tree, but, yeah.
Yes, we did a lot of work with, as a city, we became part of something called the Vanguard Cities, and there were 6 of us at first, and Chicago and Boulder and Cleveland was in there, and a handful of others. We got to go visit Cleveland, and I always joking with them that like urban forestry's not hard out there because they have like a 120-foot oak tree in a cutout with turf, and there's no irrigation to it. And everyone's like, before I plant a tree, I got to design like $2 million in irrigation before like we even think about putting trees in. So it's like a difference in how we in the Southwest operate, but then my passion in getting into urban forestry was looking at the highest value use of water. And I would postulate the highest value use of water in the state is applying slow drip irrigation that we don't have as much loss with to trees in an urban zone or a rural zone or anywhere there's people, because it has such a high benefit versus the volume of water that's used. But yeah, like that's the big game out here is in urban forestry, you also have to be a little bit of hydrology to make both work.
Okay, respect the beaver.
Oh, yeah. So I am a tree steward for Tree New Mexico, but I'm also a beaver advocate for through Beaver Institute, and they go together, beavers and trees, by the way. But I also do auditing for Tree New Mexico, so we plant hundreds of trees, and there are lots of success stories. And then when you're auditing the trees 3 years later, and you go to a neighborhood and you've been there planting a tree with the neighbor and talking about the water system and how frequent and stuff, and you go back and the trees are gone, or the trees are dead, or they've been cropped, or any number of things. It's really disheartening. But this is sort of a statement and a question. I feel as a lifetime educator that we need tree education from preschool up. We need, because often the children will go home to their parents. You know, that's a cross-fertilization that will happen. But until we have a community that understands trees, we will plant and plant and plant, and we'll keep running into the same situation in which they're like, yeah, I love trees. Oh, they need watering? You know, so I really believe our educational system, both the general public and then K through, needs to be on this plant level.
And field school.
Yeah.
Yes.
I also feel like another need is like connection with our bodies. I think that kind of intelligence it can be planted here, but I think it also like playing outside, but more than that, just like physical education, but also listening, feeling, and things that I think that our education system really, really overemphasizes our thinking and rational minds, and I think a lot of that is already in us that can be tuned into. So I would just say simultaneously having some basketball games or running around or and the question about pessimism and optimism, I was corrected. I think I waffle, so I think it's a time of feeling really pessimistic and then all of this. And I do think being an artist is optimistic adventure. But I think sometimes, 40 years ago, there's a lot of writing about humans as parasites. And I really loved sort of remembering that and saying it and having a student immediately be like, oh, no. And I just remembering, oh yeah, that's not productive. You can think that and we can logically talk about that. But that's thinking that way doesn't connect us to the part of us that has the opportunity to be in real symbiosis with the world. I think that is in our bodies as well. I think we forget, so.
I just wanted to ask where we can find the tree list, the New Mexico tree list. You have it here?
The climate ready tree list?
Yeah, the climate ready.
Online, you can just Google New Mexico climate ready tree list.
Okay.
It lives,
Yeah, and then last plant Albuquerque, so if you just like type tree in Albuquerque at all, like the first thing you'll see,
Yeah.
and we link to it. So it goes like through the Nature Conservancy, but it'll be at Let's Plant Albuquerque. You'll see that list, and then connecting to a bunch of resources from like Tree New Mexico, how to plant a tree, Water Authority will give you rebates back on cost of buying a tree and irrigation for it. And then anywhere you're interested in tree information, sometimes it can be scattered. So that's a good place you can go. It'll connect to everybody who's doing what kind of thing.
Excellent, thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
Yeah, we got, yes.
In big cities, Chicago, New York, Cleveland, there are areas of sparse tree canopy. Those areas have been part of the whole redlining in the city urban planning that the government of the city, they're not going to take care as, update the infrastructure or anything like that. And, Albuquerque's a desert. So is this an issue in Albuquerque?
Yes. I mean, I don't know about redlining in particular. However, if you look at climate maps or urban heat island effect, poor neighborhoods have way less parks, tree cover, etc. I mean, I walk from my neighborhood into the country club and it's an entirely different climate. It's, you can see it, you can be on San Mateo and Central and it is gonna be 10 degrees hotter than it is in other neighborhoods. And it's, there's always, I think, social and environmental justice are totally linked together.
Yes, and healthcare deserts are
Right,
also.
and food, and, yeah.
Food deserts, all of that stuff is
Yes.
all connected.
But I just wanna say that, one of my former students here is here, Thea Swift, and she did her master's project on that very subject. And it was very beautiful and an actual path sort of forward. So my students give me hope and faith in humanity every day. So that's a thing I love about teaching.
Yeah, and then how we have a lot of canopy maps of the city, so we use systems of like plain will capture imagery, and then we can see like wavelengths of energy, and I can see trees at like a 60 centimeter box, and then which is like wild, but I can see a tree as a green thing with that. And then next year we're actually gonna have like a 10 centimeter box, so I can see that. So partly how that's tricky in a lot of cities is Albuquerque's development was a bit slower, but where we've seen canopy transition is in areas where trees have aged out, but then hard in like front yards and backyards for who lives in that community now with all the obligations on them to like survive, to like manage a landscape or manage a tree or water a tree. So a lot of where we look at the city is property that we own that we can improve the right of way to adding in median trees, or in that park that's there, we can know exactly the canopy cover of that park, and we actually have all trees in park surveyed. So I'll know exactly how big each tree is, in theory how old it is, and when it will be expected to phase out, so we can like stagger our plantings that way. And then with federal money that we receive, that's where we focus a lot on is working with like nonprofits to do the plantings on property that's not the city's. So like we get to operate a lot of trees, but that's like 1% of the city's urban canopy. Majority of those trees are not on city property. They're in the city, but they're private. So that's where we work a lot with nonprofits. And why we're doing a lot of fruit trees today is the tree that has a secondary benefit as well, of being able, how do we get into those communities with a community that has a lot of strain on it in multiple ways to have a tree grow. Because once a neighborhood really can come together, a neighborhood that's shaded is more connected and it's less hot. And when it gets hot, That's when people kind of get crazy. It's hot and you have nowhere to cool off. That's when we start seeing a lot of stressor factors. And when you have a neighborhood that has that connectability, not just stay in your home and hide from the heat, that's where everyone's looking at each other's trees, and it's like a community tree in that neighborhood. And there's definitely some neighborhoods where like there's always like a little old lady that you make the friends with in a park, because then she'll bring you Capri Suns when you show up. But that knows the history of that area and is really good at shepherding the green space that's not operated by the city. So trying to create more of that as a community like basis, and having a shaded space where people gather in the desert.
I just want to thank, I think that's a good way to wrap up. I just want to thank the panelists. It's really inspiring and wonderful to have you here. And thank you, Viviette, for spearheading this and having us here.
Thank you, Katya, and thank you to the panelists. Thank you, Let's Plant ABQ for partnering with us. That's really special.